Good evening, Saints, from Trinity Christian Fellowship, coming to you the evening of Wednesday from my camper van again, just for some privacy. I have a fairly small house, and it's kind of noisy in there very often, especially when Janie's home, and she is tonight. I wanted to talk to you this evening about the phrase, "God will not give you more than you can handle." That is a paraphrase of a verse from 1 Corinthians 10. Very often it makes these lists that you'll see going around the internet of Bible verses that are used out of context. And interestingly enough, I do think that this is a very good candidate for a list like that. If I was to make a top 10 or a top 25 list of verses used out of context, I would probably include this verse on the list, but interestingly enough, most of the list I see get it completely wrong. And it turns out that this verse finds itself to be very, very relative, very, very relevant, to the situation that we're living in right now, with so many aspects of our lives being turned upside down. I'll just start by reading the verse to you. So this comes in a little ways down, about halfway through the chapter, 1 Corinthians 10. Paul is talking about the nation of Israel that God led out of Egypt, right? And then they spend 40 years wandering around in the desert after entering the promised land, and 40 years before they enter the promised land, and then of course entering after that. But you'll recall during those 40 years after leaving Egypt, but previous to entering the promised land, that it's kind of it's not a lot of high points. It's sort of story after story of them failing, and God striving with them, and them failing again and again and again. A lot like the book of Judges. But at any rate, in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul is remembering this period of time and all of the errors that they made, and he's basically saying, hey, you guys have these stories, first century Corinth, you guys have these stories of what went on 1,500 years ago. Don't make the same mistakes that they made, right? And it's in the context of that he says this: "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man." Right? Any temptation you go through, it's been a common thing to all human beings throughout all time. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. Now, to say God will not give you more than you can handle that's a pretty good paraphrase of that verse. That's what he's saying. God will not give you more than you can handle. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So, what's Paul saying here? The reason we don't like this, and the reason people throw a flag on the play and object to this notion of God not giving us more than we can handle, is in the late 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, we have shifted worldviews in the West entirely, and this is something that a lot of secular scholars have noticed as well. Probably the best book on this subject is by Philip Reith. He's a secular intellectual. It's called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. This guy's not even a Christian, but he was observing many decades ago that in the West we were shifting our worldview from that of what would stereotypically be called a Christian worldview, or a Judeo-Christian worldview, where we saw the world through the lens of sin and righteousness, holiness, morality had to do with objective notions of right and wrong that related to God. Ethics were determined by all that, and we shifted to what he called a therapeutic worldview. And what he meant by that is we didn't abandon words like good and bad, but in the old worldview, good meant righteous, and bad meant sinful, right? And we've shifted to where when we say something's good, we mean it's therapeutic. We mean it makes me feel nice. When we say something's bad, it means it makes me not feel good. So, for example, right, if somebody accuses you of wrongdoing, that makes me feel guilty, so that is therefore bad. And so, largely, we kept the vocabulary from our previous worldview, but we changed the definitions, right? And that's what's going on here when people object to a paraphrase, not a bad paraphrase, but that God will not give you more than you can handle. When people hear that, God will not give me more than I can handle, they immediately think therapeutic worldview, right? That's we're so immersed in it, we don't even realize how pervasive it is. But God will not give me more than I can handle. So therapy, this notion of my emotions and my feelings and senses of contentment or overwhelm, or being overwhelmed or whatever, and we feel overwhelmed all the time. And so clearly God cannot be saying he won't give us, put so much on our plate that we'll be overwhelmed. Well, God, when he is writing to his people in Corinth in the first century, he does not have a therapeutic worldview like we have. And so this verse, how you feel or how sort of emotionally overwhelmed you are, that's not even in the view of the writer or the audience. Neither one would have assumed such a thing. When they said God will not give you more than you can handle, they're immediately going to think through this motif, this worldview of righteousness and sin. Okay, so God is not going to bring more into your life than you can handle. So what they would hear by that is God, right, the sovereign God of the universe. He nothing happens beyond his purview. And so if something happens to me, right, whatever it is, in this, of course, we're all thinking in our modern context about, losing our jobs and unemployment and sickness and disease and pandemic and quarantine. But none of those things are ever going to give us an excuse to sin to where it is acceptable that we did so, right? And you can hear that in the second part of the verse. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. In other words, when hardship comes, and all hardship, there is no hardship that is outside of God's sovereignty. I know there's a lot of that kind of talk going on today. That's silly. That's absolutely silly. In no way, shape, or form can you read the Old Testament or the New Testament or both together and arrive at a conclusion like that. But there's debates over, does God causing things versus God allowing things or whatever. But nothing happens that is outside of his control. If he allowed it, it doesn't mean he necessarily directly caused it. There's different camps sort of come down differently upon on that, but no terrible thing happens outside of God's allowance, right? And that's the book of Job makes that through narration. The narration of that story makes that abundantly clear. But when God lets painful circumstances come into our life, we never have an excuse to sin. And the sin that's in the very previous verse, by the way, he is talking about how the children of Israel grumbled, as some of them did, right? Grumbling. I believe the old King James is murmuring. Now that's going to step on some of our toes, right? When hard times come, it is inexcusable for us to ever murmur or grumble to God about the hardship that we are suffering under. That's deeply convicting. I think that can point the finger of accusation at a lot of us, right? And I think we can all find some sin to be repented of in regards to that. Now the Bible's not it is not ignorant to the fact that we are dust, right? And we are fragile, and we are mortal man. In the second letter to the Corinthians, we see Paul writing this: "For we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt like we had received the sentence of death." Right? So the Bible does occasionally kind of talk about us and our relationship to our Creator and the created world that we live in through this notion of therapy, through this lens of our feelings and how we are coping and all those kinds of means that we love to talk about so much. It's not ignorant of that, but it is just not the primary lens that the Scriptures, or for that matter, most of human history, thought about our relationship, again, to our Creator and to the created world around us. Far more often, the Bible, when it speaks to us, is talking about our relationship to God and to the world that He made through this lens of righteousness and sin and holiness and so forth. And so, anyway, that's a good exhortation for us. Let's ponder the worldview of the world that we live in. Let's make sure that the worldview that we have is a right one. Let's be aware of you have to be aware of the wrong one sometimes to avoid falling into the trap of it. And you know what? God will not give you more than you can handle. Will He give you so much that sometimes you fall on the floor sobbing? Yeah. Will sometimes He allow so much in your life that it feels like you're going to literally pass out from being overwhelmed? Yes, sometimes He will. In fact, the very next sentence in 2 Corinthians of what I just read, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Why did God allow them to feel as if they had received a death sentence? But that was to make us rely on not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Right? Sometimes God will give you more than you can handle, emotionally speaking, in order to force you to rely on Him. And so let's be thankful for the God who sustains. Let's be thankful for the God who accuses. Right? We do not serve a God that wants to leave us in our sin, but wants to hold up that mirror of the law and show us what is good and show us what is right and lead us in the way everlasting. I found that business about grumbling and murmuring to be quite convicting. Maybe you do as well. But I hope this is helpful, saints. And I hope I can see you guys face to face soon. I miss you all.